We want to begin by stressing the importance of inclusive and equitable educational opportunities for English learners. Key features of inclusive, equitable, and non-discriminatory practices and procedures includes the use of research-based assessments, as well as appropriate assessments for gifted and talented identification, which we know ELs are less likely to be in these programs. But is it because we tested for gifts and talents or language? So let's begin by looking at step one, identifying the critical needs in language and vocabulary development and some special considerations for English learners. First, we need to understand the students, and this requires data analysis. I begin this discussion on assessments with some hesitation. I want to be careful to not infer universal decisions when it comes to English learners and language and literacy assessments. English learners are not a homogeneous group, and their individual experiences and backgrounds must be taken into consideration. Accurate assessment is critical for understanding both how ELL students are doing and where added support is needed, just as with every other student. But valid and reliable ELL assessment is notoriously difficult. There are some things that we need to consider for these ELL students. But first, I do want to point out that these assessments listed here are not to be looked at chronologically. That aside now, what we need to ask, what's most critical to ask is to determine is what information are we seeking? English language skills and or literacy skills, and if literacy in their native language or English or both. Literacy and language are interrelated but independent. Generally speaking, our districts do not have screeners that are based solely on the English language. If we have a newcomer with no exposure to the English language, regardless of their age or literacy level in their native language, these test results will do nothing for us other than flag the student, which we already knew would occur because of the language demands of the assessment. We're therefore assessing the literacy skills of a student in the English language, which they may have had limited exposure in. This is why we need to use screeners that measure skills that are predictive of future performances, such as phonemic awareness and alphabetic principle. Some of the screeners that schools use have Spanish versions, and I'm frequently asked if they should be using this version with their Spanish-speaking students. And my answer, it depends. It always depends with English learners with an assessment. If we want to know how to advance an ELL's literacy skills, the screener should be administered in the language of instruction. So if an ELL is educated in English, let's test that student at grade appropriate measures in English. If the ELL is in a bilingual or dual language program, both languages need to be assessed at appropriate grade level. It is important to note that most ELLs don't have a significant difficulty developing the foundational skills in a timely manner if they are explicitly and systematically taught with a particular focus on language transfer. However, English learners take much longer to develop adequate fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. We need to be careful when looking at outcome assessments. There's a rich body of literature that's found that content area assessments generate highly biased scores among EL students because they may not represent the content knowledge of the EL student. This can be due to the language proficiency level, precluding them from being able to fully demonstrate their content knowledge on tests that are administered in English. Accommodations help increase the validity and reduce the bias of these tests, but not completely. An English language specific outcome assessment, the OELPA on the other hand, is assessing language. The 4 domains tested are listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and this data is critical to look at alongside with all the other assessments. But this too is not enough information alone, as we'll soon see. So where can we really hone in on the needs of the EL students is with the diagnostic and formative assessments. In reality, diagnostics should be a set of steps rather than a specific tool, for we can't exclude the individual student background information. And when determining what diagnostic to administer, we need to ask, as previously stated, what do we want to know? And then how do we figure this out given the individual student's education and history experiences? We need to reflect on language as a possible barrier and minimize language to determine the skills that need support. Only then do we determine which language is most appropriate for the assessment. Therefore, the language of the diagnostics depends. When teachers are equipped with all this data and they have knowledge of language acquisition, they can look at formative assessments such as oral language usage and writing samples with a much more focused intent and purpose. And this should be the driving factor for instructional decisions. So let's take a look at 2 writing samples from a second and first grader. Both were flagged on district screeners. Both were level 1 on OALPA on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest. Neither of these assessments, however, provided enough information by themselves to assess what the student's needs are. For as we can see here, the needs are vastly different. One student has no prior exposure to literacy in the English language, and the other student did. And both of their needs are quite different, even though they had almost the same screener and summative scores. So this is a perfect example of why we need to know more about a student and evaluate all of the data. On the right, we see another writing sample which shows why formative assessments and individual student information is critical. We can see that this 3rd grade student has limited vocabulary in English, which are those circled words. But we can also see that there is a need for diagnostic literacy assessments. For this individual student, we need to look at both language and literacy. But how do we assess language other than on the OALPS or OALPA? The links on the left are for oral language rubrics that some of our EL teachers use, for we know that oracy leads to literacy. So these are helpful to track progress towards vocabulary acquisition and language proficiency. So let's listen to a student, and normally we could maybe use one of these rubrics as we listen to her, but let's listen to this student and try to assess what some of her language needs might be.
My favorite part of school is when we we learn a lot, and that our nice is so our teacher here is so nice that they make us learn new things, and I like hanging out with my friends, then learn more. And why do I like that? It's because that our teacher wants us to learn so we can grow more higher, and I think it's the best because
This student was a level 3 speaker, which is kind of middle of the road, but as you could hear, she still needed a lot of think time and wait time to process her language before it could come out. And sometimes she jumped ahead, and we really need to work on stretching her vocabulary. So this is why it's really important that we start paying attention to students' oracy skills in our classroom setting. And we need to be asking questions throughout this whole process to determine the student needs, as we do for all students. But with English learners, we have to ask very specific questions for this population so that we can really narrow down the focus of what skills we need to hone in on. So I provided some research here for you that you can look into further on your own, should you wish. And with that, I would like to open it up for discussion.